Hello and welcome to Unstress. My name is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Now, before I start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I am recording this podcast, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Well, I don't know about you, but when I hear the word dysfunctional pattern clearing, I think of my life and I think of certain times in my life where perhaps my behaviour or the way I was with somebody or something may not have been as I wished it were. And so looking at dysfunctional patterns in our lives can have an enormous impact on our well-being. My guest today explores those things. My guest is Michael Adamedes. Now, Michael is an author, a public speaker, and a psychotherapist with more than 40 years of clinical experience. In 1983, he established the Euroa Centre, one of Sydney's first integrative health centres. Interestingly, in 1983, I began the Sydney Holistic Dental Centre. Just an aside. Some synchronicity there, though. Michael has established a private counselling practice on the Sunshine Coast in Queensland, Australia, and regularly conducts workshops in all aspects of the inner journey, both in Australia and overseas. Now, Michael describes himself as a detective into the conscious mind. Within the first hour of working with a client, he can usually identify their patterns of negative thinking and the causes of their self-sabotaging behaviour. Now, self-sabotage is something that we are really focusing on in these next few episodes, but I digress. He has created and developed dysfunctional pattern clearing, a therapy for releasing the psychological and emotional patterning from a person's body memory. And this goes back generations. We really do cover a wide area of history in this episode. We even go back to the Big Bang. You can't go back much further than that as far as I know. Many of his clients have experienced transformation from being alone and unhappy to falling in love and finding a lifelong partner, from struggling in their business to become financially secure, or from being depressed and disillusioned to being vital and happy. We actually spoke to one of his clients, Rob Pryor, in a recent episode, and I would encourage you to listen to that. I think we're releasing that in this same week, who not only overcame depression, but also stage 3 kidney cancer. Now, Rob, as you will hear from that episode, got that diagnosis 10 years ago, and I had lunch with him a few months ago and after our podcast, and I've got to tell you, he looks very well. Look, there is so much to talk about in this episode. It is a wonderful, stimulating, really empowering episode. I hope you enjoy this conversation I had with Michael Adamedes. Welcome to the show, Michael.
Thank you, Ron. Happy to be here.
Michael, some time ago, well, it'll be released in the same week, I had the pleasure of speaking to Rob Pryor, who had quite an experience, not only early in life with weight and kidney and all sorts of other psychological issues, which not only did you help him resolve, but you co-authored a book. But then he had cancer, and with your advice and guidance, he actually cured himself of cancer. And I had lunch with him a few weeks ago, and he looks very healthy to me. So I felt like I had to sit down and talk to you. And thank you for joining me today.
Oh, my pleasure.
Now, listen, I thought it might be interesting to get your perception because you're a psychotherapist. You've been in this health area for 40 years.
Yes.
I'm just interested to hear your view of how we are going health-wise in general and mental health in particular, because there's been a downward trend.
Yeah, well, look, I think there's a slow decline of physical health because we're living in a very stressed world and the pace of life is increasing. People are under tremendous stress and the environment is very toxic with, heavy metals, radiation, all these things that are going on. But in comparison to mental health, I think mental health is really deteriorating at a very fast pace. And I think people are experiencing a lot of pressure in mental health. And yes, the extreme places where people are bipolar and heavily addicted and, neurotic, that's gradually becoming more intense and greater. But where it's really showing up is in the depression and anxiety levels. The levels of depression and the levels of anxiety are significant. And the psychology behind depression is a deep loneliness, and the psychology behind anxiety is a fear, a sense of uncertainty. And we are living in a world that's just feeling more and more alienated, and also in a world where people are under extreme pressure to survive. So there is a huge pressure on mental health for sure.
It's a sort of the perfect storm, isn't it? And I think I've often said that the way we approach this in our health system is a great economic model, but it's not a very good health model. I think it's something like 1 in 6 people are on antidepressants. And we did a program with Dr. Martin Whiteley, who wrote a book called Overprescribing Madness. And he shared the statistic that 95% of antidepressants are prescribed by GPs, and the average GP appointment is 10 to 15 minutes. And with what you're describing and you're focused on, that's really so inadequate, isn't it?
Oh, look, it's ridiculous. There is a place for antidepressants, and that's when we're in a crisis situation. Now, a crisis situation could be someone's suicidal and someone's experienced a really terrible event in their life. For example, there was a client of mine who had been with this girl for some period of time, a couple of years, and then eventually they broke up and she left him, and he just couldn't cope with it, and he was in extreme danger. So for someone in that situation where there's a peak negative experience, then there needs to be some sort of safety net to prevent him from dropping through the hole, so to speak. But for people who are suffering anxiety or depression in general every day, it's the worst thing, because what it does is it gives you an artificial confidence, and it prevents the person from actually dealing with the real underlying cause. So if there was a case to be made for antidepressants, I would say no more than 1 to 2 months. After that, you're becoming dependent. Now, you may be just psychologically dependent to begin with, but it won't take very long before you become physically dependent as well. So, look, it's a no-no because you're never going to heal it. It's like I've got a weak leg and I'm given a crutch rather than exercises to build the muscle in my leg. So I'm never going to strengthen the leg. I'm always going to use the crutch. And over time, the strength in the leg deteriorates. Not only have I lost muscle strength, but also the bone density is depreciating. And so I now need to put myself in a wheelchair or something because the crutch isn't working anymore. And so it's a downhill slide. Big mistake. But again, it's one of those situations where at the end of the day, each individual has to take personal responsibility. And that's the key. If you're waiting for an expert to heal you, you're in a lot of trouble. If you go to an expert for advice and you take that advice and then you use it in conjunction with a positive lifestyle and you're making strong changes in your life, then that could be a good way to go. But the big mistake is people aren't accepting personal responsibility for the nature of their health, either physically or mentally.
And I guess it's just because it's so readily prescribed, it provides a crutch without the personal empowerment that can actually go exactly what you've just said. It's kind of saying, here, I'm depressed. The doctor says, here is the solution. And hey, guess what? You're depressed and you may need to be on that medication all your life. And we've done a program with a psychiatrist, Dr. Mark Horowitz, who has a personal and professional experience at coming off antidepressants. And as you say, it's a very, very challenging and thing to do and needs to be carefully managed in itself.
Yeah, no, it's a big mistake. It's not the way to treat it. And
But Michael, you talked about cause, and I think this is what is so interesting.
yes.
Perhaps it's unique. I don't know. I mean, a lot more people are looking at this. I know you're into the dysfunctional pattern clearing, and when I hear that, it kind of resonates with me, even though I'm not completely sure of what it means. Well, tell us about dysfunctional pattern clearing.
Dysfunctional pattern clearing is an amalgamation of a number of different techniques, and it's timeline therapy in a child, NLP, and also Scientology auditing. And it's a mechanism, and having done it over quite a considerable time, all of those particular modalities, and then I would see each one had something that was contributing, but there was another piece that was kind of missing. And then after about 20 years of working with these various modalities, it was like, here is the best from this field of working mentally. Here is the best from this field. And putting it together came up with this thing, which it's like basically it's an understanding of who are you and what is the nature of the pattern that we're working with. And fundamentally, the psychology that I'm working with, a person's belief pattern, is a self-induced hypnotic trance. Self-induced, I do it to myself, hypnotic, in that I totally believe it to be real, and it's a trance. I'm living in it. And so, you could call it the ego, you could call it the personality. And so this programmed mind sets up the reality we experience. And reality exists in its multifaceted form, but we're filtering out certain components of it. And those components become our reality. And so to understand the nature in which someone's programmed, it's a matter of looking at their childhood. And for most people, it's occurred certainly in the first 4 years of their life, and 7 years for sure. And then if I'm looking to get a simple snapshot of the personality, I would say a considerable amount of that comes from mother. So your mother, now it's purely a biological fact because you spend 9 months in your mother's womb and she's your primary caregiver. And as a consequence, she's the primary role model. And the transference of one pattern of behavior to another, an adult to a child, occurs through a process called resonance. It's how they feel, and the irony is the more they love you, the more you love them, the greater the field of resonance between you and the greater the effect. For example, in my life, I was the eldest of 5 kids, and I was, the hero of the family. And my mum and dad put me on a pedestal and really, adored me. And so I got tremendous encouragement, lots of opportunities, and a lot of special treatment. Yet when I reached my teenage years, I was really suffering from terrible insecurity and a belief that I wasn't good enough, because that's what my mother believed about herself. So my mother, as much as she loved me and supported me and did the best she could for me, that gave me a tremendous advantage. That was a good thing. But in the big scheme of things, it probably only represented at most 25%. 75% of my personality is running around, I'm not good enough, I'm worthless, I'm nothing. Because my mother believed that about herself, coming from a background and a Greek village many years ago and all the rest of it, immigrant, came to Australia, this thing about being an immigrant, being a woman, or uneducated, all the story. And so that's the pattern I pick up. But then to truly understand this thing about dysfunctional pattern clearing, that's only one strand. And at best, it only represents 35% of your personality, roughly. 5% is the actual physical experience. It's called your biography. But 60% of your personality predates before you were even conceived. 95% of the programming you experience was in place before conception. 35% is coming through the ancestral line, and some 60% comes from another time. And this whole thing is, we are a field of light that has attached to a physical entity called the body. And that at the death of our physical bodies, this conscious light thing continues. The traditional understanding of it is to call it a soul. But it is just a kind of a religious understanding description of it. We're far more than that. We are these beings of light that fundamentally cannot die as far as consciousness. The physical body absolutely will perish. And this is not just me being, religious and whatever, because when I first started in this business, I studied biology, chemistry, mathematics. I had a very rational understanding, although I was brought up in a Greek Christian family and I was very devout as a child. When I went to university and after I finished, I thought the whole Christian religious thing was kind of just an interesting way to explain life, because they didn't have a scientific understanding of it. And it was an attempt to try and understand why life is the way it is. But it's more than that. There's a fundamental truth. And look, there's a guy called, I've got it in front of me here. I've just printed it out. He's professor of psychology at the University of Connecticut. He's Dr. Kenneth Ring, and he has studied near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences. And he has got access to over 25,000 documented cases of near-death experience over the last 40 years. And there are presently 50 research groups worldwide studying the phenomena. It's hugely researched. It's not one of these things. And he's written some 7 books, and he's a world authority on the thing. And there is a pattern to when people leave, and it's postulated up to 1 in 7 people who die have an out-of-body near-death experience prior to actually fully leaving their body. It's far more common. So to look at 25,000 cases is like nothing. It's more like, if they really began to look at it, it'd be more like 25 million cases.
And what's the message from those experiences? What's the common theme that comes from those experiences?
The message that comes from those experiences is a tremendous sense of relief, and this sense that I don't have to fear dying. It's not the end of who I am. And there's actually a 6-stage process that they've put together from the near-death experience, which is this great sense of overwhelming peace, a sense of body separation, an entering of darkness, and then seeing a light, that's the 4th one, and then entering another realm of existence through the light, and then deciding or being told they have to come back again. And so they do come back. Now, this is not, there's thousands upon thousands of cases researched. You just go on the internet. I don't recommend any of your listeners will watch it. But see, to me, this is key to understanding who you are, and it's a key to understanding your psychology, and it's a key to understanding what health is. Because the traditional psychological model is, I think, therefore I am, where the
Yes.
reality is I am, therefore I think. They got it the wrong way round.
I
And
mean, it's so interesting to hear you quote that, because I think that came from
it
Descartes,
did, came from
who had a huge impact on the way modern medicine is practiced. Break everything down into its smallest parts, make everything statistically significant. The mind and body are separate. I think, therefore I am, and you're saying wrong way around. I am, therefore I think. Brilliant. I love that.
Yes, well, the thing is, Descartes was right in the sense that he was lifting us out of religious
Yeah.
superstition.
Yes.
So, in
Yes.
the process of lifting us out of religious superstition, they threw the baby out with the
Yes.
bathwater because
Yeah.
within that religious superstition, there were fundamental truths. And
Yes.
so, it's actually a step forward to go from emotional, poetic, because what we have with emotions, which is you could call it a religious, poetic understanding of life, to a rational, scientific understanding of life, I call it the queen and the king. Now, the queen and the king, that's the emotional and the psychological, rational, come together. But in the coming together, a third force is born. A child comes from the mother, father. You have intuition, another way of knowing. There is another way of perceiving existence beyond the rational mind and beyond the feeling state of the body as well. There is an inner knowing. Now, we have been, told this is all nonsense. But again, research. There's another guy called Dr. Ian Stevenson, professor at the University of Virginia School of Medicine. And he talks about reincarnation. And he has 12,000 recorded cases of reincarnation, of which he distilled it down to 800 or 900. And of the 800 or 900, has written 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 books. And his recent book is Reincarnation Type. And he talks about how people, look, here's one here. He's 19, this is a different one. His 1997 work, Reincarnation and Biology, a contribution to the etiology of birthmarks and birth defects, reported 200 cases in which birthmarks and birth defects seem to correspond in some way to a wound on the deceased person whose life the child had recalled. So he went and investigated with very critical mind as to the reality of people reliving and remembering. In our society, because we've been so rationally educated, it's very difficult for people to retain a memory of reincarnation past about the age of 5 or 6, past the age of going to school. But in different cultures, you will have this idea of reincarnation memories persisting into adults, and particularly with Indigenous tribes, Indigenous groups, and groups that still have a very strong ethnic connection to their cultural heritage. This is quite normal. Again, he gives tremendous research. He talks about this boy in India who kept seeing himself reincarnated back from a family, and their family were bakers and had a biscuit factory, and he was married, and then he's like 6 or 7-year-old child, took him back to the village or the city, some 1,000 kilometres from where he was born, and could describe the factory. He even saw his wife, his brother, who were now elderly people. He knew how the factory was set up, where the machines were, how the money operated, the whole thing, which would have been beyond. But then this was one of hundreds of cases he's examined. So the nature of reality is that not only are we a physical body, but we have an energetic metaphysical component to us. And this is nothing new. It's just been shut down. There is a very interesting piece of information. There's a guy called Dr. Edward Bach who passed many years ago, and He was a surgeon and a casualty medical officer at the University College Hospital in London. And he practiced for over 20 years in Harley Street. And he joined the laboratories at the Royal London Homeopathic Hospital in 1919. And he's famous for the development of the Bach flower remedies. Now, this is a medically trained doctor. He figured this whole thing out in the 1920s. There's nothing new in any of this. It's just the information has been sidelined, and there's only one story being made. You know, the pharmaceutical answer to health. That's it. Take a pill and you're going to be better.
Well, Michael, you know, when you say self-induced hypnotic trance, the first word that comes to me is the pandemic, but that's another story. But you know, I've just finished. It's interesting to hear you talk about reality because I've just finished a book called The Case Against Reality by a mathematician and philosopher from Stanford called Donald Hoffman.
Oh, yes.
Who, when he's done all of the calculations of mathematics, because that's how you make sense of the world, it can all be reduced to mathematics if you like, he realizes that space and time are just an illusion.
That's true.
Space and time are just an illusion, hence the name of the book, The Case Against Reality. And it occurred to me that this whole world of quantum biology and physics is something that ancient cultures have understood for thousands of years. They haven't called it quantum, but their whole concept of time and that everything is their relative, you know, everything is connected, is such a powerful message. And to hear you frame it in a different way is intriguing. In fact, another book that I've read is called The Immortality Key, which says it goes back to the Greek temple in 1500, Euryses, and the title on top of the temple is, if you don't die before you die, then you won't die when you die.
That's brilliant.
If you don't die before you die, then you won't die when you die. And I'm guessing a lot of that was to do with getting rid of the ego, letting the ego go and connecting with more than what you just see in front of you.
Totally, because look, the death of the ego, the death of the ego is just another word. The letting go of the ego, the transforming of the ego, the transcending of the ego, from an ego perspective, feels like death.
Yes.
So you have to go through the feeling of dying, which is the letting go of the ego, to get to a point where you can't die, because time and space only exists in the perspective of the ego. As soon as you let go of the ego, the ability to perceive the world through a frame of reference that we've, inherited, so to speak, then there is no time and space. And Donald Hoffman was accurate. He's right. This reality thing about reality is really perception. And so what we're saying is the perception that we're presently being fed is coming to an end. Now, in the process of bringing that to an end, we're at this metaphysical crisis. And the crisis is that we're suffering on so many levels: our health, the environment, our finances, the tremendous stress and pressure that's been put on us. And so there has to be a breakdown of the system, and in part a breakdown of the individual, in order for that individual to, in a sense, reinvent themselves. Now, that process of breakdown, the way it's kind of talked about at the moment, only about 40% of people are going to get through it, and some 60% of people won't be able to make that transition for, whatever reason. It's part of the evolution of their awareness, the evolution of their consciousness. And there's no right or wrong in this. This is just a reflection of humanity is a different level. The people who are listening to your show are not the everyday. They're part of the 40%. And see, the world, I actually see the world in basically three types of people. One is there are followers, people who follow the story and what. Two, there are students, and they're the most people who are going to be watching this show, and they're trying to understand the nature of who they are, how to improve themselves. They're aspirational, maybe not necessarily materially, they could be, but they're certainly aspirational in having a better quality of life. The third one is what I would call disciples, who recognize the nature of existence is really to discover themselves. So who are you? Where are you going? And why are you here? Now, if you come to terms with those questions, I guarantee your health is going to go through the roof. If you're drifting and thinking this is a random event and you have no purpose and no meaning, crash burn, your life is going to go down, and it's like, because the fundamental sense of your identity has a huge impact on your health. You'll find that really devout Christians, really people of strong faith, are able to stay healthy in spite of all the nonsense that goes on in their lives.
I mean, isn't that part of the issue and the thing that, the people love certainty in life. I mean, religion provides a certainty, the difficult questions. How did the earth come about? Well, God created the earth in 7 days. I mean, what a great story. And, I don't want to offend anybody, but that is a very simple solution to a very, very complex problem, and people are drawn to it. Similarly, I'm depressed. I go to see a doctor. I want a simple solution until, using the expression, the shit hits the fan, and then you continue along that journey or you become a student.
That's it.
And a lot of people describe a diagnosis or a major trauma. I mean, I've spoken to a lot of people who have had cancer. I've spoken to a lot of farmers. I'm interested in regenerative agriculture, who have gone through drought or financial ruin or fire or whatever. And this was a major turning point in their lives, which they would say, ironically, was the best thing that ever happened to them.
Exactly. And that's what happened to me. I went through a massive marriage breakup, and I went into depression, and I was depressed. And then in the process of trying to heal my depression, I went into therapy. And then some year or so after being in therapy, I turned around one day and realized I have an aptitude in therapy. And next thing you know, I become a therapist. But that wasn't my choice. I went into therapy because I had so many problems that unless I worked on unless I went into full-time therapy, I wouldn't be able to work through my problems. It was like, it's like...
is that a common theme of therapists that, they actually, have dealt with their own issue? And in fact, the discussion I've had with several psychiatrists is that, therapists should be in therapy before they go into therapy, before they deliver therapy.
Absolutely. And lawyers are seeking justice.
Yes. But listen, I just want to come back to this 35 maternal line resonance and 5% biography and this ancestral line and 60% ancestral.
Now, what happens is your biography is about 5% of who you are, roughly, and then your ancestral memory through your parents is about 35% of who you are. And then 60% of who you are is really from this soul memory. And you have lived before. You cannot die. You will not die. Your physical body will die. This attachment, this ego attachment to this physical form will come to an end. But the mind you die on, the belief patterns you depart this existence with, are the belief patterns you'll reincarnate and be reborn back into again. And you'll go through the same story of having to look at why was my birth difficult? Why was I born to a mother who didn't believe in herself? Why, did I find it difficult to form intimate relationships? All these sort of things. Now, In part, it's an ancestral wound I'm bringing from my mother and my mother's line and my mother's mother and her grandmother and all that, and also in part from my father. But down the ancestral line, the majority comes from mother because of the biological reasons, and a minority comes from the father. And often when I've worked with people, they've said all my issues with my father left us when we were 3 years of age and he wasn't there and he deserted us and da-da-da-da, and mum brought us up and did all these things. And the reality is, even though father was the trigger point and there are father issues, the greater issue was how did mum deal with father leaving and how did mum compensate for father not being there? And to a great extent, mother probably never, ever fully recovered or resolved it.
Yeah. It is interesting to hear you say that, because apart from the obvious, which is you're carried by the mother and the mother nurtures you for the first 2 years of life. And I've got 5 grandchildren varying in age from 1.5 to 8. And I've watched that progression as the children separate psychologically a little bit more from their mother at around 2 or 3 and realise and they also inherit all the DNA. We inherit the DNA of our mitochondria, which produces our energy from the mother. So this maternal line it makes perfect. Do you think though that reincarnation, and I want to ask you also about rebirthing.
Yes.
Do you think this is a problem of semantics? We're just using the wrong language, because if we use the language to say, well, all the atoms which make us up have been here before for millions of years, and they're going to be here for millions of years in a different form, and something on a quantum level is what explains this rebirthing and reincarnation?
In part, that's correct, because what happens is these atomic structures and these atoms have been in existence and they're evolving and forming, and they in turn have an independent intelligence of their own. And so what you find that the physical body that you hold has a history of life that's at least 2 billion years old, that goes back to the primordial swamps, as a form coming together as a human that's over 1 million years old. But predating that, going back to before the Big Bang, or at least to the Big Bang, at least if you want to say 5.5 billion years, 13 billion years, whatever the Big Bang was, this sense of spark consciousness has been a continuous evolution. And this spark consciousness did not originate on planet Earth, even though planet Earth came into existence some 3 to 5 billion years ago, and 2 billion years of that was the formation of life. There is an independent life force that comes through the atomic structure and the subatomic structure, but there is also another sense of intelligence that's united with it. And look, it's getting more wooey. The more I
it's go on. Well, I'll tell you what. I've often said I've used this expression, and this is just blowing my mind because it extends it way beyond my thoughts. I've always said, look, we're all connected, so we're all affected. That's just a simple roll off the tongue expression, but put in the context of what we are talking about now. I mean, what are we connected to, and what do we affect? We are connected. Boy, are we connected.
We are connected. Whatever I do to you, I do to myself. And whatever I do to another, I do to myself, whether I recognize that. And if you see, the way I describe it is, imagine you're the index finger, or I'm the index finger. My normal state of awareness is I am an index finger, you are my middle finger here, and these are these other digits that are around me. If I shift my sense of understanding who I am, I suddenly get a realization that I'm a palm and that you are part of who I am. And then if I keep going, I become the arm and the body, and there are other palms. Now, unlike, it's just 2 hands and 2 legs, whatever that is, 20 digits, we're talking about billions. But ultimately, as I raise my frequency, my sense of consciousness, my sense of awareness, it's more inclusive. We are all the same. The sense of separation is really just an immature perspective on the understanding of who you are. When a child is born, it's me. Then after a little bit of time, it becomes me and mum. Then after a bit of time, it's me, mum, and the family, my father and my brothers and sisters. And then after a bit of time, it becomes me, mum, my family, my brothers and sisters, and the community around me. And then after a while, it becomes me, my mum, and then it becomes the collective human population. Then after a while, it goes to all life on planet Earth. And then if I continue to keep expanding, not only am I all life on planet Earth, but I'm it's called MEST, mass, energy, space, and time. I'm all existence. I'm part of all existence. Now, what we're presently saying is all theoretical and quite interesting. The reality of what, for it to make a difference, is people have to have a direct experience of it. Unless you have a direct experience of it, you won't have a body memory understanding. It won't go from an intellectual thing to becoming integrated into your body and becoming wisdom. And so it's that body memory mind understanding that makes the difference. So the process of people being ill, even on one level, it's debilitating and it's terrible. On another level, just as we were discussing at another time, one of my, Dr. John Harrison, who wrote this amazing book, Love Your Disease, It's Keeping You Healthy, basically was pointing out that your disease was symptomatic of something that isn't working. Now, on a physical level, it may mean a change in lifestyle, diet, actions, things like that. But on a deeper level, it's changing the way you think and feel. And then on a deeper level still, it's changing the destiny that you were born into. And I say the destiny I was born into is not the destiny I will die with. My destiny is to transcend the destiny of my birth. And we're put into a destiny that has lots of challenges. And if those challenges are met, great. If those challenges aren't met, you're going to become ill. Your relationship will crash.
Yes. Well, look, you mentioned John Harrison, and that was my own personal experience, which I shared with you, which is absolutely right. I mean, having suffered from hay fever and allergies all my life to get to a terrible stage, I had 2 sessions with him exploring exactly what you're talking about, and I haven't had any allergies or hay fever for the last 20 years. And he said, when I started in medicine, I thought everything was physical, then I thought it was mental, and now I realize everything's spiritual. And my 2 sessions with him were exploring my relationship with my parents. So, you're preaching to converted. We've laid the foundation, Michael, very nicely for a discussion. But let's just come back to reality here, because somebody is sitting in front of you with an illness, with a concern, and you have made this point. You've said 4 years old, and of course the Jesuits say, show me the man or the child at 7 and I'll show you the person, or man. I'm trying to be, politically correct nowadays. So this is very true. How do we re-engage with this pattern, which we may not even be aware of?
Well, there's a number of ways to do it, but the usual way I do it is by firstly identifying the symptom. Now, say, for instance, someone is suffering anxiety. Keep it, something simple. And they're finding they're anxious, and then I will then get a history of it. Now, when are you feeling your anxiety? Every time I get in the car with my partner, my spouse, if they're driving the car, or when I'm feeling my anxiety when I get on board an aeroplane, or I feel this anxiety when I hear someone shouting or something like that. And so then what I'm searching for is a trigger point. I want a place in that when they actually last felt anxious. And I said, well, when did you last feel anxious? Well, I last felt anxious about 2 days ago. And then I said, well, what happened 2 days ago? Well, 2 days ago, this bill came in, and then my partner panicked and didn't think we could pay it, and we were worrying about what's going to happen, and then I felt anxious. And later on, I thought about it, calmed down, and I realised, no, we can manage this. We'll just go and offer them a part payment and then pay it off over 3 or 4 weeks. And having done that, it actually solved the problem. They were more than happy to do that. And so it wasn't a big deal. But for that moment, it felt panic. And then I would ask that person, where did you experience the panic? Now, for instance, for that person, they felt it in their solar plexus. And so what I'm then saying is you've got to now create an artifact, concretize it. It's like this feeling in your solar plexus, give it a colour, give it a shape, and what's it made of? So it's dark grey, it's round, and it feels like stone. Perfect. Then I would ask, when in your life did you first experience a dark grey stone thing in your solar plexus? Depending on the individual, some people say, there's no way, I've got no idea. What are you talking about? This is ridiculous. Other people, you could connect to it, because then you can understand the nature of what's going on in one of 3 ways. You can remember it, you can rationalise it, you can work it out, or you can imagine it. And so all 3 ways are legitimate, because your imagination works differently to my imagination. If I asked you to write a story, say 50,000 words, about 2 people living on a deserted island, and go away and put 10, 12, 15 pages together, and then I went and did the same thing, we could have 2 different stories. You could have 2 brothers. You could have a husband and a wife. You could have 2 sisters. You could, for a start, your imagination works one way, my imagination works the other, even though we're given the same, script to, 2 people on a deserted island. And from that, I would probably be able to do a reasonably good assessment of your personality purely from the story and how these 2 people related. Because there's no way you can use your imagination without drawing on your subconscious. And so use your imagination. And if people then use their imagination, away we go. And then you'll find that it goes back to a childhood event. That childhood event, here's the child at 4. What are you doing? You're sitting there. You're hearing mum and dad have a fight. Dad's having a fight because mum spent too much, and dad's worried that he won't be able to pay the bills and whatever, or mum's going on, and this little kid's sitting there 4 years of age picking up dad's anxiety or mum's anxiety, whatever the story is. And then it ultimately comes back to a decision about themselves. I live in a world that somehow is unsafe. I live in a world that can't provide for me. I live with people who are unable to manage their lives. Finance, a drop in cash flow equates to a survival issue of some sort. And it goes on because,
I love that that you because I can imagine you posing that to a patient, a client, and them not being, well, some would be able to remember and identify, but I love the way you're tapping into their imagination. Okay, you can't remember, but let's imagine you could remember. What would be interesting, because you're tapping into what their lived experience is.
Yeah, because the answer to that person's issues lies within their subconscious. I know the answer to everything about myself. It's safe to allow the answer into my awareness. I want to know the answer. So the first thing that people have is, because they can't immediately connect the dots, they assume they have no insight to the knowledge that's there. But the fact that you can't connect the dots doesn't mean you don't have the answers. We just need to help you find the answers. And then firstly, accept that that's a possibility. And secondly, here, I can guide you and we can work it out. And then it's a process of interpretation. I would probably say the majority of people who come to see me, we can work that way. But people who have been very strongly rationally trained, i.e. medical practitioners,
Yes.
solicitors and academics, find that methodology problematic because they can't allow their mind to free associate. And so then I use a different methodology for them. And that methodology is basically, all right, why do you think that's causing an anxiety? Then I just ask them to start thinking through their own thinking process. And then I would say, well, they'd be saying, I'm feeling anxious. Well, why would you be feeling anxious? Well, I didn't think I could pay the bills. Why didn't you think you could pay the bills? Well, we don't have enough money. And then what's the consequence of not being able to pay the bills? Well, because we don't have enough money, it may mean that we're going to be kicked out on the street. When was the first time you ever worried about being kicked out on the street? Oh, well, that was back as a child, because my mum and dad used to, on a regular times, used to worry about there not being enough and they wouldn't be able to pay the rent, or they wouldn't be able to meet the mortgage, or they wouldn't be able to do something. And so there was a tremendous anxiety that mum felt, because mum was at the effect depending on dad to bring the pay packet home. And dad's out there working, so at least he's got some control over his material existence. She doesn't. She has to stay at home passively looking after the kids. That's a big deal. That's a freak out. That requires tremendous sense of inner trust, a real sense of inner security that my life is safe.
I know.
Very few people have that.
Yeah, I know that one of the things I was listening to some of the stuff you've done or reading about it, these three basic questions of I am unworthy, I am unsafe, I am alone, are really fundamental questions in this dysfunctional pattern that we can so easily part of. You use a lot of different. There's a few other things I wanted to ask you because, rebirthing is an interesting one, and I've heard the term used a lot. And maybe it's my rational Descartesian mind, but tell me about rebirthing. How does that work? And I know you use breath work, and presumably there's a connection there.
Well, see, rebirthing is just a term that a man, Leonard Orr, who repopularised it during the 1970s, gave it. And it's actually not quite accurate. And rebirthing is really just a form of breath work. And breath work has a spectrum. You go from a very passive meditative sort of breath work, and you go to a very cathartic emotional sort of breath work. Now, rebirthing is on the emotional cathartic side of breath work. He initially, this is Leonard Orr back in the 70s, initially he was a therapist himself, an ex-minister of religion that went into becoming a counsellor and a therapist, and he was experimenting with working in a hot tub. And when he was on one occasion, he was in a hot tub and had what we call the spontaneous emotional release, the spontaneous rebirth, the spontaneous experience. And so the immersion in a hot tub of water activated his body memory and brought to the surface a sense of anxiety that had been suppressed below the level of feeling. He believed that the water would do it, and then later on discovered it was the breathing, and took the technique out of the tub and just laid people down to breathe. But he was of the impression that you healed and transcended the ego if you went back and relived and released the trauma of your birth. And that's why he gave it the term rebirthing, to rebirth yourself, to get like to die and be reborn again, or this to your own emotion. But this is, in a sense, a limited understanding of the experience, because that's assuming that we are biological robots and that our entire existence is based on our biology, and it's only a part of us. Because although we have this biology, which is to a great extent influenced by our ancestral line, that's epigenetics, i.e. Bruce Lipton, and genetics, which is to do with the colour, shape, structure, and certain dispositions, that is only a part. We are also this entity, this energetic entity that around the time of birth incarnates to this physical entity, and we unify with it. And this understanding really didn't take into account the fact that we existed as an individual entity prior to this. So it was a limited understanding of the therapy at the time. But you're talking about the 70s. And he in his day was advanced. This was leading edge therapy. So it's just a more dynamic form of breath work. And it's primarily to induce an emotional response. The ultimate purpose of breath work is meditation. It's ultimately a union and awareness with this sense of who you are. Now, you mentioned earlier a medical practitioner before we were talking who was doing very interesting research with psilocybin, I think it was.
Yeah, psychedelic-assisted therapy.
Yes.
Dr. Ehrlich.
That's brilliant. Now, that is a way of inducing a connection to this other state through the ingestion of this plant material, which is a legitimate kind of methodology that's been in use for thousands of years. And it's now being brought back into modern psychotherapy, which is fabulous because it needs to be. And one of the major exponents of this is a guy called Dr. Stan Grof, who has taken more than 50,000 people over a 60-year period through LSD and researched it to a tremendous extent. And he would be, I would say, one of my heroes in the work in this area. And I've been very blessed to have worked with Stan as well. And the whole thing is that there is another dimension to us. And in order to connect to this dimension, we have to go through our physiology. We have to go through our psychology. Then we can connect to this dimension. The purpose of the rebirthing process is to put you strongly into your physical body, to release the stress the body is holding, to then take you to the next level, to release the underlying emotions, and in turn to understand the psychological patterns associated, to then pop through into an awareness and a connection that you are more than all of this. Now, sometimes you can jump and go straight up there, but if you do that, you miss going through what's called the pain body, the density of the emotions that sit in your physical body. And I don't know, Eckhart Tolle, who's written the book The Power of Now, talks a lot about your pain body, which is really the same idea of we are born with this inherited pain. It comes through ancestral memory, and it also comes through this energetic field that connects with us, our soul. And the process of the breathing and the thing with the dysfunctional pattern clearing and the whole thing about trying to heal any illness that you may have or resolve a relationship or make your career work, it's all the same thing, just applied to a different purpose, is to examine the underlying psychology and in turn the lifestyle it presents and the symptoms that you're experiencing, to bring it all into harmony and to find a place of peace within yourself. Because the nature of who you truly are, on one level is you're an angel in training. You're not this...
I like that.
Yeah, you're not this biological robot. Yes, but you have to work with the biological robot. You can't escape it. You can't jump away from it. You can't reject it. You must love it, embrace it, and strengthen it and empower it. And the same with the ego. The transcendence of the ego is actually paradoxical. You have to have an empowered ego before you can surrender your ego. Before a disempowered ego can't. It's like transcend money in order to transcend money, you have to have accumulated money. Once you've accumulated money, you can transcend money. But if you've never accumulated money and say it doesn't matter, you'll be trapped. I've been there, done that.
It's interesting to hear. It's interesting. I've been very interested in the breath for 20 or 30 years now, and the whole work. I'm actually doing a course with Stanislav Grof on holotropic breath work. So
Fantastic.
and I love the way you put that the breath is on a spectrum, because one end of the spectrum is, say, 6 breaths per minute, and you're meditating.
Yes.
Then you have Wim Hof, who hyperventilation for a short period of time, prepare the body for a stress like cold or something. And taking it even further, I believe the holotropic breathing is 20 minutes of intense hyperventilation followed by several hours of quite out-of-body experiences.
Yeah,
and don't try this at home. I don't think.
No. Well,
it should be.
What happens is that don't try it at home, and the body has its own safety mechanism. But yeah, absolutely. So the breathing process that I do would be pretty close to where holotropic breathing is, maybe one step just before. Look, to me, holotropic breathing is a very intense process, and it really depends on the need of the individual. If I've got someone coming to see me and it's a pregnant woman, I'd be very reluctant to put them into an intense holotropic breathing process. If I've got someone who's very strong, physically fit and secure within themselves, and I have an understanding of their psychology, then yes, let's go for it, because that's an extreme. It's called gradient. The gradient is quite steep. So I'm pushing someone into a process at a very deep end. My attitude is always start at the shallow end of the pool and walk towards the deep end of the pool and work within your capacity. And if we need 2 or 3 goes at this before you can fully function in the deep end of the pool, so be it. It's far better for it to work within your capacity than to push it too hard and too fast, too quickly, because something in the body starts to shut down. And you really, my experience with is, as long as I'm very clear about what the intent is and I'm gentle and persistent, then I get the greatest results. And,
Well, wow. Gee, we've covered some territory here, Michael. You do incorporate other things like intermittent fasting and meditation, all that sort of stuff too. That's part of your program too. Listen, it's been great. I want to just take a step back. One question before we finish. Taking a step back from your role as a psychotherapist, because we are all individuals on this health journey in our modern world. What do you think the biggest challenge is for us as individuals on that journey?
I think the biggest challenge is personal responsibility. And what happens is we are being taught that the circumstances of our life is due to events outside of who we are. And it's owning every single piece of it. It's like the fact that something didn't work in my life. It's a matter of recognizing why hasn't it worked, and why didn't the relationship work? Why isn't my health working? Now, the purpose of personal responsibility is not to apportion blame. It's not a matter of blame. At the end of the day, you're not to blame. I'm not to blame. This experience we're in, 95% of it was in place before we were conceived. We had no choice. So there is no blame. We are innocent in this. The only reason you take personal responsibility is to direct your attention inward, because it's only through an inward attention that you can truly transform yourself. So in a sense, life puts you into a straitjacket. You can't break the straps by saying, oh, I've got to change these external things, or this person did it to me, or I've had bad luck. It just won't work. You'll still stay trapped. The only way you get out of the straitjacket is by shape shifting. You change who you are and the jacket no longer fits and drops off you. And so the circumstances of your destiny are there. You can wiggle and go and do whatever you want, change one thing, block the fact that this illness isn't going to happen, but you'll get something else happening if you haven't figured out the underlying reason why that illness happened in the first place. And if this thing didn't happen in your life, relationship-wise or business-wise, why didn't it? No baddies. You're not a baddie. That other person's not a baddie. Apportioning blame actually is an unconscious saboteur. It's really just a matter of being a dispassionate detective into your own unconscious mind. Now, if I can learn to not take my personality personally, then I can really start to work on myself, because the greatest hindrance to my self-awareness is my own sense of shame and my own sense of not liking myself or feeling bad about myself or feeling wrong. I can feel bad. I can feel uncomfortable and not okay, but not feel bad that I feel bad. I just feel bad, I'm not scared about being scared. I'm scared, okay, but I can face the fact that I'm scared. And now, one step at a time, one little step at a time. How do you eat an elephant? One mouthful at a time. How do you deal with this big issue around feeling afraid or scared, or this thing about being sick or having cancer? One step at a time. No baddies here. And it doesn't help to say they've done it to me. I can look at the medical profession, at the pharmaceutical industry, the government, the whole thing, lost in space. They are really doing a bad job to the point of being catastrophic and destructive for billions of people. But so what? That's none of my business. My business is, how do I feel? If I'm sitting around being upset about them being corrupt, then I'm on the same frequency as them. The best thing I can do is ignore them, be aware that's taking place, now look after myself. It doesn't matter what they're doing, it only matters what I'm doing. That's how it works.
Michael, what a great note to finish on. I've so enjoyed our conversation. We will, of course, have links to allow people to find you and learn more about it, but it's been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom with us today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure, Ron. I really enjoyed talking with you. Thank you.
Well, as I mentioned in the episode, in the various times in my life when I have had psychotherapy, and I've found them always to be very useful, very empowering. They came at various points in my life. And I think just the fact of talking to somebody is a cathartic experience in itself. But when it's directed, as Michael does, in a detective-like way to uncover dysfunctional patterns that need to be cleared in order for you to move forward physically, mentally and emotionally, well, this is a powerful tool worth exploring. We will, of course, have links to Michael's site where he runs various workshops, or you can engage with him online in a consultation. I know I have done so myself, and I have found it an incredibly empowering and stimulating session. I hope this finds you well. Until next time, this is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Be well.
This podcast provides general information and discussion about medicine, health, and related subjects. The content is not intended and should not be construed as medical advice or as a substitute for care by a qualified medical practitioner. If you or any other person has a medical concern, he or she should consult with an appropriately qualified medical practitioner. Guests who speak in this podcast express their own opinions, experiences, and conclusions.